The school auditorium was not very big, but on that afternoon it felt crowded and heavy with noise. Rows of metal chairs filled the room, and students sat in small groups, whispering and laughing while waiting for their turn. On the stage stood a polished piano under bright white lights. It looked grand and serious, almost out of place in a school where most days were filled with casual chatter and ringing bells. It was evaluation day for the music class. Teachers from different departments had been invited to sit in the front row. Some of them were there out of interest. Others were there because the principal had encouraged them to support student activities. A long table was placed in front, with papers, pens, and plastic water bottles lined up neatly. The atmosphere was a mix of excitement and nervousness. One by one, students went up to perform short pieces they had prepared. Some played simple melodies. A few made small mistakes but kept going. The teachers nodded politely, writing comments on their sheets. There was light clapping after each performance. Nothing too dramatic. Nothing too memorable. Near the back of the room, she sat quietly in her seat, waiting. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers gently pressing against each other, as if they were already practicing on invisible keys. She wore a plain outfit, nothing fancy or attention-grabbing. Her shoes were slightly worn at the edges. Her hair was tied back in a simple way. If someone looked at her for only a second, they might not notice her at all. When her name was called, she stood up slowly. A few students turned around to look at her. Some of them knew her from class. She was not loud. She did not talk much. She never tried to stand out. In group discussions, she usually listened more than she spoke. As she began walking toward the stage, a faint sound of laughter came from the front row. It was not loud, but it was noticeable. One teacher leaned slightly toward another and whispered something with a small smile. Another teacher raised an eyebrow as if surprised that she had chosen to perform such a difficult piece, based on what they had seen written on the program sheet. "She picked that?" someone murmured softly. There was a quiet chuckle. It was not cruel laughter. It was the kind that comes from doubt. The kind that says, "This might not go well." She heard it. Of course she did. The auditorium was not large enough to hide such sounds. For a brief second, her steps slowed. A warm wave of embarrassment rose to her face. She felt her ears grow hot. Her mind tried to convince her to turn back, to pretend she had forgotten something. But she kept walking. The stage lights felt brighter than she expected. As she stepped onto the platform, the soft murmurs in the room became louder in her ears. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her every move. The piano bench stood waiting at the center. The instrument looked almost intimidating up close. She paused beside it and took a slow breath. In that moment, her thoughts drifted far away from the auditorium. She remembered the first time she touched a piano. It had not been shiny like this one. It had been old, with small scratches and slightly faded keys. It stood in the corner of a community hall that also served as a place for meetings and small events. The room had thin walls, and sometimes the noise from outside would interrupt her practice. But to her, that piano had been the most beautiful thing in the world. She had not started lessons at a very young age like some of the other students. There had been no professional instructor sitting beside her every week. Instead, she had learned slowly, piece by piece. She watched videos when she could. She borrowed music books that others had finished using. She repeated simple exercises again and again until her fingers moved without thinking. There were days when she felt frustrated. Days when the notes would not sound right no matter how hard she tried. Days when her hands felt too small to stretch across certain keys. But she never stopped showing up. After school, after finishing homework, after helping at home, she would find her way back to that piano. Music became the place where she felt understood. When words were difficult, notes were easier. When the world felt too loud, the piano gave her space to breathe. Back in the auditorium, none of that history was visible. The teachers did not see the evenings she spent practicing alone. They did not see the times she replayed the same passage 20 times until it sounded clean. They only saw a quiet student in simple clothes walking toward a grand piano. She adjusted the bench carefully and sat down. The room grew slightly quieter. A teacher cleared their throat, preparing to write notes. A few students leaned back in their chairs, ready to watch what they assumed would be an average performance. She placed her hands on her lap for a moment and closed her eyes. Her heart was beating fast. She could hear it in her ears. She remembered the laughter. She remembered the whispers. For a second, doubt tried to sneak in. What if they were right? What if she wasn't ready? She opened her eyes and looked at the keys. Black and white. Simple. Familiar. These were the same shapes she had seen hundreds of times before. The same pattern her fingers had memorized. The piano did not care who was watching. It did not care who doubted her. It would only respond to touch. She lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys. In the audience, someone shifted in their seat. Another student stifled a small laugh, still expecting something awkward. One of the teachers glanced down at the program sheet again, as if double-checking the name. The room held a thin thread of anticipation. She took one more quiet breath, and then she pressed the first key. The sound that filled the auditorium was not hesitant. It was not weak. It was clear and steady, carrying through the space with surprising strength. The note did not shake. It rang out confidently, almost as if announcing that it belonged there. The soft whisper stopped. Her fingers moved to the next notes and then the next. Each one flowed smoothly into the other. There was control in her touch, a calm rhythm that showed careful practice. The melody began to form, not rushed, not forced, just steady and sure. In the front row, a teacher who had chuckled earlier slowly lifted their head. The pen in their hand paused above the paper. This was not what they expected. She did not look at the audience anymore. Her focus stayed on the keys. Her posture straightened naturally as the music grew fuller. The piece she had chosen was not simple. It required balance between both hands, soft sections followed by stronger passages. It demanded attention to detail, and she gave it everything. With each measure, her confidence grew. The nervous beating of her heart began to match the rhythm of the music instead of fighting against it. Her fingers moved with familiarity, gliding across the keyboard in patterns she had repeated countless times in that small community hall. In the audience, the mood began to change. Students who had been leaning back now leaned forward. A few exchanged surprised looks. One teacher slowly lowered their water bottle without taking a sip. The laughter from earlier felt distant now, almost forgotten. She reached a gentle section of the piece, and her touch softened. The notes floated lightly through the room, delicate and controlled. There was emotion in the way she played, not dramatic, but honest. Felt real. For the first time that afternoon, the auditorium was completely silent. No whispers, no shifting chairs, no quiet jokes, only music. And in that silence, something began to shift. Not just in the room, but in the way people saw her. They were no longer looking at a quiet student who seemed out of place. They were watching a musician. The sound of the final note from her performance still seemed to hang in the air long after her fingers lifted from the keys. For a brief second, no one moved. The silence felt different now. It was not filled with doubt or quiet laughter. It was heavy with surprise. Then the applause came. It started from somewhere in the middle rows. A few students clapped softly at first, almost as if asking permission. Then more joined in. Within moments, the entire auditorium was filled with the sound of real appreciation. It was not the polite kind of clapping people give just to be kind. It was loud, honest, and full of energy. She blinked, slightly startled. She had imagined many endings in her mind while practicing at home. In some of them, people barely reacted. In others, they gave short applause and moved on quickly. She had never allowed herself to picture this kind of response. As she stood up from the bench, she kept her eyes lowered for a second. Her heart was still racing, but now it felt different. It was no longer fear. It was relief. In the front row, the same teachers who had chuckled earlier were clapping too. One of them leaned forward, studying her with a serious expression. Another whispered something again, but this time there was no smile. There was curiosity. She gave a small, polite nod and walked off the stage. The bright lights no longer felt blinding. The steps down seemed lighter than when she had climbed up. As she returned to her seat, Students shifted to make space for her. A few of them looked at her with wide eyes. "Where did you learn that?" someone asked quietly. She only gave a small smile and shrugged. The truth was not dramatic. There had been no famous music academy. No expensive lessons every week. No grand piano waiting in her living room. Her journey had been slow and simple. After school that day, while most students talked excitedly about the performances, she slipped out quietly and walked home. The sky was soft with late afternoon light. The air felt cool against her face. She replayed the performance in her mind, note by note. She thought about the laughter from earlier. Instead of feeling hurt, she now felt calm. It no longer had power over her. The music had spoken louder than anything else. When she reached home, she placed her school bag down and went straight to the small corner where a keyboard stood against the wall. It was not new. Some of the keys had slightly faded edges. The stand was a little uneven, but to her it was precious. She ran her fingers gently across the keys without turning it on, remembering how everything had started. Years ago, she had not even known how to read sheet music. She simply liked the sound of piano melodies. Whenever she heard music in movies or on television, she paid attention to the background instruments. Something about the piano made her pause. One day, during a school trip, she had seen a piano in a community center. She asked if she could try pressing a key. The sound had surprised her. It felt powerful even though it was just one note. After that, she kept asking for chances to practice there. The center allowed students to use the room when it was free. She began visiting after classes. At first, she only pressed random keys, trying to copy simple tunes she remembered. It sounded messy and unorganized. But she did not give up. She found free learning videos and watched them carefully. She paused and replayed small sections, copying finger placements. She wrote notes in a small notebook, drawing lines and circles to remind herself which keys to press. She practiced scales until her fingers hurt slightly. There were evenings when the community center closed early, and she had to return home without practicing. On those nights, she tapped her fingers against the table, imagining the keys. She memorized patterns in her mind. Her family noticed her dedication. They did not have much extra money, but they saved little by little. After a long time, they bought her a small keyboard for home. It was not perfect, but it was hers. That keyboard became her world. While other students spent weekends hanging out or watching shows, she often chose to practice. Not because anyone forced her, but because she wanted to. Music felt like a quiet friend. It did not judge her appearance. It did not laugh if she made a mistake. It simply waited for her to try again. Back at school the next morning, the atmosphere felt slightly different. As she walked into class, a few heads turned. Whispers followed her, but they did not sound mocking. They sounded impressed. One teacher stopped her before the lesson began. "That was unexpected," the teacher said honestly. "How long have you been playing?" She hesitated before answering. "A few years." "With a private instructor?" She shook her head. "Mostly on my own." The teacher looked surprised. There was a pause, as if trying to understand how that was possible. "Well," the teacher said finally, "you should consider formal training. You have something special." The word stayed with her all day. Something special. No one had described her talent that way before. In the past, when she mentioned wanting to focus more on music, some people had gently suggested she keep it as a hobby. They meant well. They wanted her to think practically. But yesterday's performance had shifted something. During lunch break, a small group of students gathered around her. They asked questions about the piece she played. They wanted to know how she remembered everything. Some admitted they had not expected much when she first walked up to the stage. She did not feel angry about that. She understood. She knew how she looked from the outside, quiet, simple, unremarkable. But talent does not always arrive with noise. Later that week, the music teacher called her aside after class. There was an opportunity, the teacher explained. A regional student music event was coming up. It would include participants from several schools. It was more serious than a regular school evaluation. "I think you should audition," the teacher said. Her stomach tightened slightly. The school auditorium had been familiar. A regional event would be different. New judges, new audience, higher expectations. She nodded slowly. At home that evening, she told her family. They listened carefully. There was pride in their eyes, but also concern. Competitions meant pressure. Travel. Expenses. "We will support you," they said gently. "Just do your best." That night, she sat at her keyboard longer than usual. The small room felt quiet. The outside world faded away as she practiced. She focused on improving small details, smoother transitions, clearer dynamics, better control. She knew that one good performance did not guarantee anything. She could not depend on surprise alone. She needed consistency. As the days passed, she noticed that the teachers treated her differently. Not with favoritism, but with attention. They asked about her practice schedule. They offered small suggestions. One even lent her a book of advanced pieces. But she also felt a new kind of pressure. Expectations can be heavy. When people begin to believe in you, the fear of disappointing them grows. One afternoon, while practicing at home, she made several mistakes in a row. Her fingers slipped. The rhythm fell apart. Frustration rose quickly. For a moment, she thought about the laughter from that first day. What if that version of her returned? What if the strong first note was only luck? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She reminded herself why she started. Not for applause, not to silence anyone, but because she loved the sound of music filling a room. Slowly, she began again. Outside, the evening grew darker. Inside, the small keyboard continued to play. What no one in school fully understood yet was that her journey was not about proving people wrong. It was about proving to herself that quiet dedication could lead somewhere meaningful. The regional event was only a few weeks away, and this time she would not walk onto the stage as someone underestimated. She would walk in knowing exactly who she was becoming. The day of the regional music event arrived faster than she expected. The weeks of practice had passed in a blur of school, homework, and long evenings at the keyboard. Now she stood outside a large hall in a different part of the city, holding a small folder of sheet music even though she had memorized every note. The building looked more serious than her school auditorium. Tall glass doors reflected the morning light. Students from different schools gathered near the entrance, some dressed in formal outfits, some carrying instrument cases. Parents stood nearby, offering last-minute advice and encouragement. She felt small for a moment. At her school, people now knew what she could do. Here, she was just another participant. No one was whispering about her. No one was expecting anything from her. In a strange way, that felt both frightening and freeing. Inside the hall, the stage was bigger than she imagined. The piano at the center looked polished and powerful under soft golden lights. Rows of seats stretched far back. 3 judges sat at a long table in front, flipping through papers and speaking quietly to one another. She found her assigned seat among the participants. Some students were confidently discussing their pieces. One talked about studying under a well-known instructor. Another mentioned performing in multiple competitions before. She listened silently. For a second, doubt tried to return. She remembered the first evaluation day at school, the quiet laughter, the low expectations. That memory had once made her nervous. Now it reminded her of how far she had come. Her name was somewhere in the middle of the performance list. That meant waiting. As the first few students went on stage, she paid close attention. The level was high. Fingers moved quickly across keys. Some pieces were complex and dramatic. The audience clapped politely after each performance. She noticed something important, though. Even the most confident performers showed small signs of nerves. A slight pause before beginning. A quick breath between sections. No one was completely fearless. When her turn was announced, her body reacted before her mind did. Her hands felt cool. Her heartbeat became louder again, just like on that first school stage. She stood up and walked toward the piano. The walk felt longer than it probably was. The lights seemed brighter. She avoided looking directly at the judges. Instead, she focused on reaching the bench calmly. As she sat down, she adjusted the bench slightly, just as she had practiced. Small routines gave her comfort. Familiar movements reminded her that this was not new. She had done this before. She placed her hands gently on her lap and took a slow breath. In that moment, the hall disappeared. She was no longer in a large building filled with strangers. In her mind, she was back in the small community room where she had first practiced. She could almost see the slightly worn keys, the plain walls, the quiet evenings. She reminded herself why she loved playing. It was never about winning. It was never about applause. It was about the feeling when music flows smoothly from the heart to the fingertips. She lifted her hands and began. The first notes were steady, not rushed, not too soft. She focused on clarity. Each sound filled the hall cleanly. The piano responded beautifully, richer than her keyboard at home. As the melody continued, she let herself settle into the rhythm. Her fingers moved with the memory of countless practice hours. The difficult passages that once felt impossible now felt natural. She did not look at the judges. She did not look at the audience. She kept her eyes gently on the keys or slightly ahead, as she had trained herself to do. Halfway through the piece, there was a section she used to struggle with. It required quick hand movement and careful timing. In practice weeks ago, she had stumbled there many times. Now, as she approached it, her mind stayed calm. Her fingers moved smoothly. The notes flowed without interruption. A small wave of confidence rose inside her. In the audience, a few people leaned forward slightly. The judges exchanged brief glances. One of them stopped writing for a moment and simply listened. She reached the softer middle section of the piece. The mood shifted from powerful to gentle. Her touch became lighter. The hall felt almost fragile in its quietness. She allowed herself to feel the music instead of only counting beats. Each note carried emotion, but she kept control. She had learned that passion without control can become messy. Balance was important. As the piece built toward its final section, her energy grew stronger. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, but steady and confident. When she struck the final chord, she held it just long enough to let the sound fully fade. Then she slowly lifted her hands. The silence that followed felt different from the silence at her school. This was not surprise. It was thoughtful, measured. Then applause filled the hall. It was not as explosive as the one at her school, but it was respectful and genuine. She stood, gave a small bow, and walked off the stage with calm steps. As she returned to her seat, she felt something surprising. Peace. No matter the results, she knew she had done her best. She had played the way she wanted to play. Clean, honest, focused. The remaining performances continued, but her mind was steady. She no longer compared herself to others. She simply listened and appreciated their music. When all participants had finished, the judges stepped away to discuss results. The room buzzed with quiet conversations. Some students looked anxious. Others seemed confident. She sat quietly, hands resting on her knees. She thought about the journey again. The old piano, the small keyboard at home, the laughter at school, the applause that followed, the long nights of practice. No matter what happened next, those moments already mattered. After what felt like a long time, the judges returned. One of them stepped forward with a microphone and began announcing special mentions and awards. Her heart began beating faster again. Third place was announced. Applause followed as a student walked up proudly. Second place came next. There was a brief pause before first place. She told herself not to expect anything. She reminded herself that many talented students had performed. Then she heard her name. For a second, she thought she had imagined it. But the applause confirmed it. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood up. The walk to the stage felt unreal. The judge handed her a small trophy and certificate, smiling warmly. Beautiful control and emotional balance, one judge said quietly as she accepted the award. She nodded, unable to find words. As she looked out at the audience, she realized something important. The victory was not about proving others wrong. It was about proving that quiet effort counts. When she returned home that evening, she placed the small trophy beside her keyboard. It did not look grand or expensive, but to her it symbolized years of dedication. Her family hugged her with pride. There were smiles, laughter, even a few happy tears. Later that night, when the house was quiet, she sat down at her keyboard again. She did not play the competition piece. Instead, she played something simple, soft, familiar, because deep down, she knew that the real reward was not the applause, not the trophy, not the title. It was the journey from being underestimated to being understood. And this was only the beginning. Winning the regional event changed something in the way people looked at her, but it did not change the way she looked at herself. The small trophy still stood beside her keyboard at home, but it did not become the center of her world. The next morning, she still woke up early for school. She still carried her books in the same worn bag. Life continued, steady and simple. But news travels fast in a school. By the time she walked through the front gate, several students had already heard about her win. Some congratulated her with wide smiles. A few asked if they could see the trophy. Others simply stared with quiet respect. The teachers greeted her warmly. Even those who had once doubted her now spoke with admiration. The principal called her to the office during second period. She felt nervous again, unsure of what to expect. Inside the office, she was met with a kind smile and a handshake. "We are proud of you," the principal said. "You have represented the school well." There was talk about featuring her in the school newsletter. There was mention of a small ceremony during the next assembly. She nodded politely, still not fully comfortable with so much attention. For years, she had practiced in quiet rooms where no one watched. Now eyes followed her in the hallway. At first, it felt strange. During lunch, she noticed a few younger students whispering and pointing in her direction. Not in a mean way, but with curiosity. One of them gathered enough courage to approach her. "Can I learn piano like you?" the younger student asked shyly. The question surprised her. She had never thought of herself as someone others would look up to. She smiled softly. "Of course," she said. "It just takes practice." That simple answer stayed with her for the rest of the day. It just takes practice. In the past, she used to believe that talent was something magical that only a few people were born with. But her own journey had shown her something different. Skill grows quietly, step by step, when no one is watching. A week later, the school assembly took place. Students filled the auditorium once again. This time, she was not there for evaluation. She was there to be recognized. As she stood on stage holding the certificate, applause echoed through the room. She remembered the first time she had walked onto that same stage, hearing soft laughter. Now, the sound was completely different. The principal spoke about hard work, about dedication, about believing in oneself. Her name was mentioned with pride. She felt grateful but also slightly overwhelmed. After the assembly, something unexpected happened. The music teacher approached her with a thoughtful expression. "There is another opportunity," the teacher said carefully. "A larger competition at the national level. It is more serious. It will require stronger preparation." The words hung in the air. National level. That sounded big. Bigger than anything she had imagined. "It won't be easy," the teacher continued. "The standards are high. But I believe you can try." Try. She liked that word. It did not promise success. It only asked for effort. That evening, she sat at her keyboard again, thinking deeply. The room felt small compared to the stages she had recently experienced. But this small space had shaped her. She placed her hands on the keys and began practicing a new piece. It was more complex than what she had played before. The rhythm was faster. The technical sections were challenging. At first, her fingers stumbled. She did not get frustrated. She had learned patience. Each mistake was not failure. It was information. It showed her where she needed to focus. Days turned into weeks again. Her routine became even more disciplined. She divided her practice time carefully. Warm-up exercises first. Technical passages next. Full run-through at the end. Some evenings were exhausting. There were school exams to prepare for. There were responsibilities at home. Sometimes her back ached from sitting too long. Sometimes her fingers felt stiff. But whenever she thought about stopping early, she remembered the younger student who had asked if they could learn like her. She wanted to be someone who did not give up easily. At school, the attention slowly became normal. People no longer stared as much. The excitement settled into quiet respect. That felt more comfortable to her. One afternoon, while practicing in the school music room, she noticed something different. The teacher who once chuckled during her first performance stood by the door, listening silently. After she finished, the teacher stepped inside. "I owe you something," the teacher said honestly. She looked confused. "I misjudged you that day," the teacher continued. "I should not have laughed. I am sorry." The apology was simple, but it carried weight. She felt no anger toward the teacher. In fact, she appreciated the honesty. "It's okay," she replied softly, and she meant it. That moment taught her something important. People can change. First impressions are not permanent. Sometimes, all it takes is one honest performance to shift someone's perspective. As the national competition approached, pressure increased. The music teacher became more detailed in feedback. Small corrections were made again and again. Tempo adjustments, better control of dynamics, cleaner transitions. Perfection is not the goal, the teacher reminded her. Expression with control is the goal. She wrote that sentence in her notebook. Expression with control. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she sometimes wondered what would happen if she failed at the national level. Would people still believe in her? Would the applause disappear? But then she reminded herself that her journey did not begin with applause. It began with curiosity and love for music. One weekend, she was invited to perform at a small community event. It was not a competition, just a gathering where local families came together. The stage was simple. The audience included children, parents, and elderly people. She agreed to perform. When she sat at the piano there, the atmosphere felt warm and relaxed. She played without fear, without judges, without expectations. Afterward, an elderly woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "That reminded me of my younger days," the woman said gently. "Thank you." That comment touched her deeply. Music was not only about awards. It was about connection. On the night before the national competition, she could not sleep easily. Thoughts moved through her mind like restless notes. What if she forgot a section? What if nerves took over? She sat up quietly and went to her keyboard one last time. She did not play the entire piece. She only played the opening section slowly. The first note rang softly in the room. She smiled. No matter how large the stage became, it always started with one note. The next morning, as she prepared to leave for the competition, she looked at herself in the mirror. She did not see the quiet girl others once underestimated. She did not see a winner or a champion. She saw someone who had worked hard, someone who had faced doubt and continued anyway. As she stepped out of the house, carrying her music folder, she felt calm. The stage ahead might be bigger. The audience might be larger. The expectations might be higher. But she was no longer afraid of laughter. She had learned that sometimes, all it takes is one steady note to change everything. The national competition was held in a large performing arts center in the capital. The building itself looked grand, with tall pillars and wide glass windows reflecting the morning sun. When she stepped inside, she felt the difference immediately. This was not a school hall. This was not a small community event. The air felt serious, almost heavy with ambition. Participants from different regions filled the waiting area. Some were warming up quietly on small practice keyboards. Others sat with headphones on, eyes closed, mentally preparing. Parents and teachers stood nearby, speaking in low voices. She stayed close to her music teacher, who had traveled with her for support. Even though she had practiced for weeks, her palms felt slightly damp. The scale of the event made everything seem bigger: the stage, the audience, the expectations. Her performance slot was in the afternoon. That meant hours of waiting. Waiting can be harder than performing. She tried to distract herself by observing others. She noticed that even the most polished performers showed signs of nerves. One tapped their foot repeatedly. Another kept flipping through sheet music even though it was memorized. It reminded her that everyone there had something at stake. When the doors to the main hall opened for participants to take their seats, her breath caught for a second. The auditorium was beautiful. Rows of red seats stretched far back. The stage lights shone down on a stunning grand piano placed at the center. It looked almost royal. She whispered to herself, "Just another piano." The competition began. Performances were impressive. Some were powerful and dramatic. Others were delicate and emotional. The audience listened with focus. The judges wrote detailed notes after each piece. As each name was called, her heart beat faster. Finally, it was her turn. Her name echoed through the hall. The sound felt distant, as if coming from far away. She stood up slowly and walked toward the stage. Each step felt steady, even though her heartbeat was strong. When she reached the piano bench, she paused for a second and looked at the keys. The white and black pattern looked familiar. No matter how grand the setting, the keyboard remained the same. She adjusted the bench slightly and sat down. The hall was silent. She remembered the first time teachers chuckled at her school. She remembered the regional win. She remembered the apology from the teacher. She remembered the elderly woman at the community event. All those moments had led her here. She placed her hands gently on her lap and closed her eyes for a brief second. She did not think about winning. She did not think about rankings. She thought about the music. When her fingers touched the keys, she felt a strange calm wash over her. The first note rang clear and steady. The sound carried beautifully across the hall. It was fuller than she expected. The piano responded to her touch with richness and depth. She moved into the opening section carefully, making sure every note was clean. Her focus was sharp. She felt the rhythm steady inside her chest. As the piece progressed, she allowed herself to sink into it. The challenging passages arrived quickly, but her fingers moved with practiced memory. Weeks of repetition showed in her control. The fast runs were precise. The softer sections were balanced. Halfway through the performance, she felt something shift inside her. The fear was gone. In its place was something stronger. Confidence, not loud or proud, but grounded. She realized she was no longer trying to prove herself. She was simply sharing music. The middle section of her piece required emotional depth. It slowed down, becoming more expressive. She let her hands become lighter. The melody felt almost like a quiet conversation. She imagined the small community hall where she first practiced. She imagined her simple keyboard at home. She imagined the younger student who wanted to learn like her. Her playing became more natural, less mechanical. In the audience, people leaned forward. One judge stopped writing and looked directly at her hands. Another judge closed their eyes for a moment, listening closely. When she reached the final part of the piece, the energy built gradually. Her fingers moved confidently across the keys. The rhythm was steady. The dynamics were controlled. She struck the final chord with clarity and held it just long enough. Then silence. It lasted for a few seconds that felt longer than anything she had experienced before. Then applause filled the hall. It was strong and respectful. Not overly dramatic, but genuine. She stood, bowed gently, and walked off the stage. As soon as she stepped behind the curtain, she let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her music teacher gave her a small nod. "You played your best," the teacher said quietly. That was enough. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. All participants gathered in the hall for the final results. The judges returned to the stage with envelopes in their hands. Her heart began to beat loudly again. Awards were announced in order. Special mentions first. Then third place. Her name was not called. Second place followed. Still not her. For a brief second, she felt a small sting of disappointment. She reminded herself that reaching this stage was already an achievement. Then the announcer paused before reading the final name. Her name echoed through the hall. For a moment, she sat frozen. It took a second for the meaning to settle in. First place. The applause sounded louder now. Her music teacher gently tapped her shoulder, bringing her back to reality. She stood and walked to the stage, her steps light but steady. As she accepted the award, the main judge smiled warmly. "Your performance was mature and controlled," the judge said. "You play with heart." Those words meant more than the trophy in her hands. When she returned to her seat, she looked down at the small medal and certificate. They were symbols, yes, but they were not the reason she had started playing. After the ceremony, several participants approached her. Some congratulated her sincerely. One even asked for practice tips. There was no jealousy in their voices, only respect. Later that evening, as she traveled back home, she stared out of the window quietly. The city lights blurred as the vehicle moved forward. She thought about the long journey from that first evaluation day at school. The laughter, the doubt, the practice in quiet rooms, the small victories, the larger stages. She realized something important. Success did not come from one performance. It came from many small choices, choosing to practice instead of quitting, choosing to believe instead of doubting, choosing to stay patient instead of rushing. When she reached home, her family welcomed her with smiles and warm hugs. The house felt smaller and more comforting than ever. She placed the national trophy beside the regional one. The two stood side by side near her keyboard. But instead of celebrating loudly, she sat down and played a simple melody. Soft, calm, honest. Because in her heart, she knew that the real reward was not standing on stage while people clapped. It was becoming someone who did not let laughter define her. Someone who let her first note speak for her. And now she understood something even deeper. The journey was not over. It was only beginning. Life did not suddenly become perfect after the national competition. The trophies sat quietly on the shelf beside her keyboard, shining in the soft light of her room. But they did not change her daily routine. She still woke up early for school. She still studied for exams. She still helped at home. The world did not treat her like a celebrity, and she did not expect it to. But something inside her had changed in a way that could not be measured by medals. Confidence. Not the loud kind that demands attention. Not the kind that shows off. But the quiet kind that allows a person to walk into a room without shrinking. At school, teachers now asked her to perform at special events. She agreed when she could, but she made sure not to let it take over her studies. She had learned balance the hard way through long nights of practice and homework. One afternoon, the music teacher called her into the classroom after lessons ended. The room felt calm, filled with the familiar scent of polished wood and sheet music. "I have been thinking," the teacher said thoughtfully. "Have you considered applying to a formal music academy after graduation?" The idea had crossed her mind, but she had never allowed it to stay long. Felt too big, too far away. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "It feels risky." The teacher nodded. "All dreams feel risky at first. But you have proven something already. Not to us. To yourself." That sentence stayed with her. To yourself. She went home that evening deep in thought. She sat by her keyboard but did not start playing immediately. Instead, she stared at the keys, remembering every stage of her journey. The first awkward notes in the community hall. The quiet laughter at school. The first applause. The regional victory. The national stage. Every step had felt impossible at first. And yet, she had taken each one. In the following weeks, something unexpected happened. The younger student who once asked if they could learn like her began staying after school in the music room. The student practiced simple scales with serious focus. One day, the music teacher asked her if she would help guide the younger student once a week. She hesitated for a second. Teaching felt different from performing. But she agreed. The first session was simple. She showed how to sit properly, how to place fingers gently on the keys, how to practice slowly instead of rushing. She noticed something beautiful in that moment. She saw her own younger self reflected in the student's careful movements. The same curiosity, the same quiet determination. "Don't worry about playing fast," she said gently. "Play it right first." As weeks passed, she began to enjoy these small teaching sessions. They reminded her that music was not only about stages and judges. It was about sharing. One afternoon, While walking through the hallway, she overheard two students talking. "That's her," one whispered. "The one who won." She did not feel uncomfortable this time. She did not lower her head. She simply continued walking, steady and calm, because she now understood something important. Winning did not make her better than anyone else. It only showed what steady effort could do. Near the end of the school year, the principal organized a final cultural evening. Parents, teachers, and students gathered to celebrate achievements. She was asked to close the event with a performance. As she prepared backstage, she thought back to the very first evaluation day. The nerves, the laughter, the uncertainty. This stage was the same one. But she was not the same person. When her name was announced, she walked out with confidence. The auditorium was full. Families filled the seats. Teachers sat proudly in the front row. She sat at the piano and looked briefly at the audience. Among them, she saw the teacher who once chuckled. This time, the teacher's expression was warm and supportive. She placed her hands on the keys. The first note rang out. Clear, strong, certain. There was no doubt in the room now. No whispers, no raised eyebrows. As she played, she felt gratitude instead of pressure. Gratitude for every mistake that forced her to improve. Gratitude for every moment of doubt that strengthened her patience. Gratitude even for the laughter that once hurt her. Because without those moments, she might not have pushed herself so far. The music flowed naturally. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she was simply being herself. When she reached the final chord, she held it softly before letting the sound fade. The applause that followed was loud and heartfelt. She stood and bowed, feeling calm and complete. After the event, parents approached her with kind words. Some thanked her for inspiring their children. The younger student she had been helping stood nearby, smiling proudly. Later that night, as she sat alone in her room, she looked at the trophies again. They were symbols of achievement, yes, but they were not the most important part of her story. The most important part was growth. Growth from a quiet girl who almost turned back after hearing laughter. Growth from someone unsure of her place to someone confident in her ability. Growth from practicing alone in a small room to performing on national stages. She gently closed the lid of her keyboard and leaned back in her chair. Her journey had never been about silencing others. It had been about finding her own voice. The next chapter of her life would bring new challenges, new stages, new expectations. There would be failures too. She understood that now. Success did not mean a life without difficulty. But she was no longer afraid of difficulty, because she had learned something that no trophy could teach. Hard work, done quietly and consistently, changes a person from the inside out. And sometimes all it takes is one steady note to begin that change. The laughter that once echoed in her ears had faded into memory. What remained was something stronger, the sound of her own belief, and that sound would guide her wherever she went next.